The galaxy had seen its fair share of peculiar diplomatic encounters, but none quite like this. When the Craxel delegation arrived at the human embassy on Mars, their first words were both unexpected and painfully on brand: "We surrender." Ambassador Sarah Chen stood frozen behind her desk, her carefully prepared welcome speech forgotten. Before her stood three of the most awkward-looking aliens she'd ever encountered. Their leader, a particularly wiry specimen named Drakir, wore what appeared to be a child's Halloween pirate costume, complete with a plastic cutlass and a lopsided eye patch. His iridescent scales shifted between shades of emerald and jade, a telltale sign of anxiety among his species. I'm sorry, Chen managed, but surrender to what exactly? We're not at war. Ah, yes, Drakir's tail swished nervously, knocking over a potted plant. He didn't seem to notice. Force of habit. What we meant to say was, we need your help. Desperately. The Craxel's reputation preceded them. Throughout the known galaxy, they were infamous for their consistent, almost impressive ability to fail at everything they attempted. Their diplomatic missions often ended in accidental insults, their trade negotiations in bankruptcy, and their rare military endeavors in immediate surrender. They were the galaxy's eternal underdogs, except they never had the satisfying comeback story that usually accompanied such a title. Chen gestured for them to sit, watching with mounting concern as Drakir's companions managed to tangle their tails together in the process. Perhaps you could explain exactly what kind of help you're seeking. Training, Drakir said, his vertical pupils dilating with intensity. Military training. Strategic training. Any kind of training, really. We've observed your species, Ambassador Chen. Humans have something we desperately need. And what's that? The ability to not lose. The meeting was quickly escalated to the highest levels of Earth's military command. Within hours, General Marcus Steele and his advisory board sat across from the Craxel delegation in a secure conference room deep within the Martian military complex. The general's weathered face remained carefully neutral as Drakir explained their situation in detail. The Craxel controlled 17 colony worlds, each more vulnerable than the last. Raiders, pirates, and aggressive neighboring species treated their territories like an all-you-can-plunder buffet. Their attempts at defense were so ineffective that some raiders had started leaving tips out of pity. Let me get this straight, Steele said, leaning forward. You want us to train your entire species in warfare? The same species that once surrendered to a malfunctioning maintenance drone. Drakir's scales flushed a deeper shade of green. That drone was very intimidating. It had a warning light and everything. He straightened in his chair, his expression becoming serious. But yes, that's exactly what we're asking. We've tried everything else. The Sarans laughed us off their world. The Zenari said helping us would be like teaching algebra to space dust. You humans are our last hope. Captain Lars, a grizzled Marine veteran sitting to Steele's right, snorted. Why us? We're not even the most advanced species in this sector. Because you understand something fundamental that we don't, Drakir said, his voice dropping to almost a whisper. You understand struggle. Humans fight like they breathe, naturally, instinctively. But more than that, you understand what it means to be underestimated. The room fell silent. Steele exchanged glances with his officers. It was true, humanity's entrance onto the galactic stage hadn't been smooth. Many advanced species had dismissed them as primitive, only to learn the hard way that humanity's relative technological disadvantage was offset by centuries of fighting experience and an almost supernatural ability to improvise in combat. Show us, Steele said finally. Show us your current military capabilities. Let's see what we're working with. The demonstration, held the next day in one of Mars' massive training domes, was both enlightening and deeply concerning. A squad of Craxel soldiers attempted to demonstrate basic combat maneuvers. The result looked more like an interpretive dance gone wrong. Their rifles, copied from various alien designs, seemed to confuse them as much as their targets. One soldier managed to tangle himself in his own equipment so thoroughly that it took 15 minutes to free him. Yet beneath the comedy of errors, Steele noticed something interesting. The Craxel moved with an underlying grace when they weren't overthinking things. Their bodies, while lacking in raw strength, possessed remarkable flexibility. Their tails, though seemingly always in the way, showed potential as an extra limb for balance and manipulation. "They're not hopeless," Steele told his officers later. "They're just, fundamentally misaligned. Everything they've tried to do, every strategy they've attempted to copy, it's all been based on how other species fight. Nobody's ever taught them to fight like Craxel. The decision to help them wasn't unanimous. Many in Earth's military leadership saw it as a waste of resources. Others worried about the diplomatic implications of training a species that other galactic powers had written off. But Steele saw something in the Craxel that reminded him of humanity's own early days in space, the desperate need to prove themselves, to survive in a galaxy that had already decided their fate. "We'll do it," Steele announced to Diarakir's delegation. "But understand something, this won't be easy. We're not going to turn you into copies of human soldiers. We're going to help you discover your own way of fighting. It's going to be painful, frustrating, and at times it might seem impossible. Are you prepared for that?" Diarakir stood, his tail for once perfectly still. He reached up and removed the ridiculous pirate eye patch, revealing an intense determination in both his slitted pupils. "General Steele, my people have been preparing for this our entire existence. We just didn't know it until now." The training program was established with unprecedented speed. Within weeks, the first wave of Craxel recruits would arrive on Earth. Nobody knew it yet, but this desperate gamble by the galaxy's least impressive species was about to change the course of galactic history. As the Craxel delegation prepared to return home with the news, Ambassador Chen found Diarakir standing alone in the embassy's observation dome, staring at the Martian sunset. "Having second thoughts?" she asked. "No," he replied, his scales shimmering with a new pattern she hadn't seen before, one that spoke not of nervousness, but of hope. "For the first time in our history, we're not running away. We're running toward something. It's terrifying, and wonderful." Chen smiled. "Well, if you're going to learn to fight, you've come to the right species. Just, maybe leave the pirate costume at home next time." "But I thought it made me look authoritative," Diarakir protested, fingering the plastic cutlass at his side. "Trust me," Chen laughed, "we're going to teach you much better ways to look authoritative." As their ships departed for Craxel space, carrying with them the promise of transformation, General Steele stood watching from his office window. "God help us," he muttered, "we're about to try and turn the galaxy's biggest losers into warriors." Captain Lars, standing nearby, shook his head. "Sir, with all due respect, are we sure about this? The Craxel? Really?" Steele's response was thoughtful. "You know, Lars, sometimes the best soldiers aren't the ones who are naturally good at fighting. They're the ones who've had to learn every single step the hard way. The Craxel have spent their entire existence learning how to lose. Let's see what happens when we teach them how to win." Learning to fight. The first wave of Craxel recruits arrived on Earth in the dead of night, their shuttles touching down at a remote military facility in the Nevada desert. As they disembarked, stumbling in Earth's stronger gravity, Captain Lars couldn't help but wonder if this whole endeavor was an elaborate joke. 300 Craxel stood before him, their scales glinting under the floodlights. They were even more underwhelming in large numbers, a collection of gangly limbs and nervous twitches. Not a single one of them looked like they could win a fight against a stiff breeze. "Welcome to hell," Lars announced, pacing before them. "For the next 6 months, we're going to tear down everything you think you know about combat and rebuild you from the ground up. Most of you will probably quit. Some of you might die. All of you will suffer." One Craxel raised a trembling hand. "Excuse me, sir. When you say die, do you mean that metaphorically? Lars pinched the bridge of his nose. It was going to be a long 6 months. The first week was nothing short of catastrophic. The Craxel couldn't manage basic physical tasks in Earth's gravity. Their attempts at formation drilling looked like a disaster in slow motion. During hand-to-hand combat training, several recruits managed to knock themselves unconscious with their own tails. But General Steele noticed something the others missed. While watching footage of the training sessions late one night, he observed a peculiar pattern. The Craxel weren't failing because they were inherently incapable, they were failing because they were trying to move like humans. "Stop the footage," he commanded, pointing at a screen showing a Craxel attempting push-ups. "Look at their natural posture. Their center of gravity is completely different from ours. We're training them wrong." The next day, Steele gathered the human instructors for an emergency meeting. "We need to rethink everything," he announced. "No more human standard training protocols. We need to develop a completely new program based on Craxel physiology." The change in approach was dramatic. Instead of traditional push-ups, the Craxel were taught exercises that utilized their tail for balance and support. Their unusual joint structure, which had seemed like a hindrance, became an advantage in specialized movement drills. Their natural flexibility, once a source of mockery, was incorporated into a unique form of close-quarters combat. Drakir, who had insisted on going through training alongside his people, proved to be a quick study. During a sparring session 2 months into the program, he managed to use his tail to sweep Lars's feet out from under him while simultaneously disarming him. "Not bad," Lars admitted, picking himself up from the mat. "Though in a real fight, I would have seen that coming." Drakir's scales shifted to a proud azure. "Would you have seen this coming?" In one fluid motion, he wrapped his tail around a nearby training rifle, flicked it into his hands, and had it aimed at Lars's chest before the captain could react. Lars blinked. "Okay, that's actually impressive." The breakthrough came during an unexpected crisis. During a routine training exercise, a sudden sandstorm forced a group of Craxel recruits to take shelter in a narrow canyon. The storm's intensity made radio communication impossible, and the humans feared the recruits would panic. Instead, something remarkable happened. The Craxel, unable to rely on their instructors, began to innovate. They used their natural ability to sense vibrations through their scales to communicate in the howling wind. Their flexible bodies allowed them to brace against the canyon walls in ways humans never could, creating living chains to rescue those who had become separated. When the storm cleared, the human instructors found the Craxel not only alive but organized and calm. They had developed their own survival strategies based on their unique abilities. "Do you understand what this means?" Steele asked his officers later. "We've been so focused on teaching them our ways that we almost missed their potential. They're not built for head-on confrontation, they're natural guerrilla fighters." The training program was radically redesigned. Instead of traditional military doctrine, the Craxel were taught asymmetric warfare, ambush tactics, and unconventional strategies. Their natural grace made them excellent at stealth operations. Their ability to squeeze into tight spaces and move silently became a crucial advantage in urban combat scenarios. Their weapons training took an unexpected turn when a young Craxel recruit named Sira discovered she could use her tail to stabilize a sniper rifle, allowing for unprecedented accuracy. This led to the development of custom weapons that integrated the Craxel's unique physiology. "Look at this," Lars said to Steele one day, showing him footage of a training exercise. A squad of Craxel had managed to infiltrate a heavily defended position without being detected. They moved like shadows, using their tails for extra mobility and their scales' natural camouflage abilities to blend with their surroundings. "They're not just learning," Steele replied, "they're evolving. They're creating their own combat doctrine." The transformation wasn't just physical. The constant failures that had once defined their species began to give way to small victories. Each success, no matter how minor, built their confidence. The nervous energy that had made them accident-prone was channeled into calculated precision. 4 months into the program, during a joint exercise with human Marines, a squad of Craxel managed to capture an entire human platoon. They had used their superior climbing abilities to scale walls the humans thought unclimbable, their enhanced sensory abilities to track movements the humans thought untraceable, and their unconventional tactics to outmaneuver soldiers with years of combat experience. "I don't believe it," Lars muttered, watching the after-action replay. "They actually did it." Drakir, standing nearby, allowed his scales to shift to a deep, satisfied purple. "We had an advantage, Captain. Everyone expects us to fail. Nobody expects us to be dangerous." The training program's final phase focused on space combat. Here, the Craxel's natural agility proved revolutionary. In zero gravity, their tails provided an extra point of contact for maneuvering, and their flexible bodies allowed them to operate in spaces too cramped for most species. They developed their own style of spacecraft operation, with modified cockpits that incorporated tail controls. Their ships, once considered the laughingstock of the galaxy, were redesigned to capitalize on their superior maneuverability. During the final training exercise, a simulated space battle against human instructors, the Craxel demonstrated just how far they'd come. Their ships moved in unpredictable patterns, using complex three-dimensional maneuvers that would have made most species violently ill. They turned their small size from a disadvantage into an asset, their vessels darting through gaps in enemy formations that larger ships couldn't possibly navigate. As the exercise ended, with the Craxel achieving their objectives while sustaining minimal simulated casualties, General Steele made a decision. He gathered all the recruits in the main hangar. 6 months ago, he began, "You came to us as the galaxy's eternal losers. Today, you stand before me as something else entirely. You're not the strongest, the fastest, or the most technologically advanced. But you've become something far more dangerous, you've become unpredictable." The assembled Craxel stood tall, their scales shimmering with pride. They no longer resembled the awkward, apologetic creatures that had arrived half a year earlier. There was a quiet confidence in their bearing, a controlled precision in their movements. "The galaxy thinks it knows what you are," Steele continued. "They think you're weak, harmless, easily dismissed. Let them think that. Because the most dangerous predator isn't the one that looks frightening, it's the one nobody sees coming until it's too late." As the first wave of graduates prepared to return home, Drakir approached Steele with a question that had been bothering him. "General, why did you really agree to help us? The truth, please." Steele was quiet for a moment before answering. "Because every species deserves the chance to stand up for themselves. But more than that, because you reminded us of ourselves. Humanity spent centuries being underestimated, dismissed, written off as primitive. We learned to turn our weaknesses into strengths, our disadvantages into advantages. We saw that same potential in you." Drakir nodded, his scales shifting through patterns that spoke of both gratitude and determination. "We won't let you down." "No," Steele agreed, watching as the Craxel ships prepared for departure. "I don't think you will. Just remember what we taught you, the greatest victory isn't in overwhelming force or superior technology. It's in making your enemy realize, too late, that they should have taken you seriously." As the ships lifted off, carrying the first wave of trained Craxel warriors back to their home systems, Lars stood beside Steele in the control tower. "Think they're ready?" Lars asked. Steele smiled grimly. "No. But neither was humanity when we fought our first interstellar war. Sometimes being ready isn't as important as being willing to fight anyway." What neither of them knew was that the Craxel's first true test would come sooner than anyone expected. As their ships disappeared into hyperspace, carrying with them the seeds of their species' transformation, a crisis was brewing in their home systems, one that would put all their training to the ultimate test. The crisis erupted just 3 weeks after the first wave of trained Craxel returned home. The Hagari raiders, a notorious pirate fleet that had been terrorizing the outer colonies for years, launched their largest attack yet. They struck the Craxel mining outpost of Nexus 7, expecting their usual easy victory. What they found instead was something entirely different. Drakir stood in the colony's newly established command center, his scales a steady, focused gray as he watched the tactical display. Around him, other graduates of Earth's training program moved with practiced precision, their previous clumsiness replaced by controlled efficiency. Hagari fleet approaching, reported Syrah, now chief of reconnaissance. 6 capital ships, 24 raiders. Standard persecution formation. Her tail coiled around her chair's support strut, allowing her to operate multiple control interfaces simultaneously. Standard for them, maybe, Drakir replied, his vertical pupils narrowing. But we're about to introduce them to some new standards. Implement Operation Quicksand. The plan was unlike anything the Craxel had attempted before. Instead of their traditional response of immediate surrender, they had spent weeks preparing the battlefield. The entire asteroid field surrounding Nexus 7 had been converted into an elaborate trap. As the Hagari fleet approached, they found what appeared to be a typical Craxel response: panicked communications, scattered defensive positions, and the general disarray they'd come to expect. The pirates charged forward, their confidence growing with each moment. "Look at these pathetic lizards," the Hagari commander broadcast on an open channel. "They're not even trying to fight back anymore." Drakir allowed himself a small smile. "That's right," he muttered. "Come closer. Just a little more." The trap was sprung in 3 phases. First, hidden gravity generators activated throughout the asteroid field, creating unpredictable gravitational eddies that played havoc with the Hagari ship's navigation systems. Their rigid, standardized formation began to break apart as vessels struggled to maintain their positioning. "They're scattered," Syrah reported. Moving into Phase 2. The second phase revealed why the Craxel had spent so much time modifying the asteroids themselves. Hundreds of small, automated drones emerged from hidden cavities in the space rocks. But unlike traditional combat drones, these were piloted remotely by Craxel operators using their enhanced sensitivity to vibration and movement to navigate with unprecedented precision. The drones swarmed the disorganized Hagari ships, not attacking directly but instead targeting specific vulnerabilities that the Craxel had identified during months of careful observation. Shield generators overloaded. Communication arrays shorted out. Weapon systems suddenly found their targeting computers feeding them contradictory data. "What is this?" the Hagari commander demanded, his previous arrogance replaced by growing concern. "Since when do the Craxel fight back?" "Since now," Drakir responded, opening a channel for the first time. Phase 3. The final phase demonstrated just how much the Craxel had learned about using their natural abilities in combat. Squadrons of their new, specially modified fighters emerged from hiding. The ships were smaller than standard combat vessels, with cockpits designed to take advantage of Craxel flexibility and extra appendages. They moved in ways that seemed to defy normal space combat doctrine, their enhanced maneuverability allowing them to execute maneuvers that would have incapacitated most other species. The Hagari, accustomed to bullying weaker opponents through superior firepower, found themselves facing an enemy that simply refused to be where their weapons were firing. Craxel ships slipped through gaps in their formation that shouldn't have existed, their pilots using their tails to operate additional control systems that allowed for complex 3-dimensional maneuvering. "This is impossible," the Hagari commander sputtered as another of his ships reported critical system failures. "You're Craxel. You're supposed to surrender." "We're not surrendering anymore," Drakir replied calmly. "But we'll accept yours." The battle ended not with a dramatic final explosion, but with something far more surprising: the first official surrender of a Hagari fleet in recorded history. As Craxel security teams boarded the captured vessels, they found the pirates in a state of near shock. "I don't understand," one Hagari officer muttered as he was led away. We had superior numbers, superior firepower, superior everything. How did we lose to you? Syrah, overseeing the prisoner transfer, allowed her scales to shift to a smug azure. Because you were fighting the Craxel you knew. We're something else now. The victory at Nexus 7 sent shockwaves through the sector. News spread quickly through interstellar channels. The galaxy's perpetual losers had not only fought back but had decisively defeated one of the most feared raider fleets in known space. In his office on the colony, Drakir composed a message to General Steele back on Earth. First engagement successful, he wrote. Your training worked better than we could have hoped. But... He paused, his scales shifting to a concerned purple. But we've also attracted attention. The kind of attention that comes with consequences. He was right. Within days, intelligence reports began flowing in from across Craxel space. Other predatory factions were taking notice. The Dernick Consortium, a powerful mercenary alliance that had long profited from Craxel weakness, was mobilizing forces. The Shadowcrest cartel, known for crushing any potential rivals, had suddenly developed an interest in Craxel territory. Most concerning of all was the reaction from the hegemony of 7 stars, one of the galaxy's major powers. Their diplomatic channels were suddenly buzzing with discussions about the Craxel situation and the destabilizing influence of human military training. On Earth, General Steele read Drakir's message with a grim expression. They're not ready for this, he told his staff. They've learned to fight, yes, but they're about to face enemies that don't just want to raid their colonies, they want to make an example of them. Then we help them, Lars insisted. We can't just leave them to face this alone. Steele shook his head. It's not that simple. Direct human military intervention would trigger a diplomatic crisis. The hegemony would see it as an excuse to extend their influence. We'd risk starting an interstellar war. So what do we do? Steele was quiet for a moment, studying the tactical displays showing the growing threats to Craxel space. Finally, he spoke. We give them what they need most, knowledge. The next phase of training begins now, but this time we're not teaching them how to fight. We're teaching them how to win a war. Back in Craxel space, Drakir gathered his most trusted officers. The command center of Nexus 7 had been converted into a war room, its walls covered with tactical displays and threat assessments. The Hagari were just the beginning, he told them. We've shown the galaxy that we can fight back. Now they're going to try to ensure we never do it again. We need to be ready. Syrah, studying the intelligence reports, looked up with concern. The consortium's fleet is 3 times the size of the Hagari force we faced. The Shadowcrest cartel has technology we can't match. And if the hegemony decides to move against us, then we'll face them too, Drakir interrupted. We're not the same Craxel who spent generations surrendering. We've learned not just how to fight, but why to fight. Each of you, look around this room. Look at what we've built, what we've achieved. For the first time in our history, we're not just surviving, we're living on our own terms. His scales shifted to a fierce, determined red. The humans taught us something more important than tactics or combat techniques. They taught us that being underestimated can be a weapon. That being different can be an advantage. The galaxy thinks they know what we're capable of. They think this victory was a fluke, a momentary aberration. He activated a holographic display showing the full extent of Craxel space, 17 worlds that had known nothing but submission for generations. Let them think that. Because when they come for us, they're going to learn what humans taught us about survival. Sometimes the most dangerous opponent isn't the strongest or the most advanced. It's the one with nothing left to lose and everything to prove. As if to punctuate his words, new alerts began flashing across the tactical displays. The Dernick Consortium's fleet had begun moving. The Shadowcrest cartel was mobilizing strike teams. And in the distant halls of the hegemony, decisions were being made that would test the transformed Craxel in ways they couldn't yet imagine. The galaxy had noticed them now. The real war was about to begin. The Dernick Consortium struck first, exactly as General Steele had predicted. Their massive fleet emerged from hyperspace above the Craxel colony world of Viridian Prime, their capital ships arranged in an attack formation that had broken the will of countless civilizations before. The message they broadcast was simple: surrender or be annihilated. In the colony's reinforced command bunker, Dra Kier studied the tactical display with an unsettlingly calm demeanor. His scales had settled into a deep, focused indigo, a color his officers had learned to associate with complex strategic thinking. "Sir," Syrah reported, her tail twitching with nervous energy, "they've deployed over 300 ships. Our entire defense fleet numbers barely 50 vessels." "Numbers," Dra Kier mused, "can be deceiving. Initiate protocol phantasm." What followed would later be studied in military academies across the galaxy as one of the most innovative defensive operations ever conducted. The Craxel had spent weeks preparing for this moment, applying everything they'd learned about asymmetric warfare to space combat on an unprecedented scale. The first surprise came when the consortium's initial scans of the colony showed nearly 800 Craxel ships in orbit. The consortium commanders were baffled. Their intelligence had indicated a much smaller defensive force. "Those can't all be real," the consortium's admiral growled. "They must be using holographic projections." He was partially right, but in a way that would prove devastating to his forces. The Craxel had indeed deployed holographic projections, but not in the way anyone expected. Among the hundreds of ship signatures, some were real, some were completely fake, and others were small automated drones broadcasting false signatures. The true genius was that the real ships were constantly switching places with the decoys, making it impossible to tell which targets were genuine at any given moment. "Target the largest concentrations," the admiral ordered. "They can't fake weapons fire." But the Craxel had anticipated this too. Their actual ships, modified with technology developed from their human training, could compress their energy signatures to appear much smaller than they really were. Meanwhile, their decoy drones could simulate weapons fire convincingly enough to draw attention. The result was chaos. Consortium ships found themselves firing at empty space while taking hits from directions they thought were clear. The Craxel vessels, piloted by graduates of Earth's training program, used their superior maneuverability to strike from impossible angles, their crew's natural flexibility allowing them to endure G-forces that would have incapacitated most species. "This is impossible," the admiral raged as another of his ship groups reported heavy damage. "They're Craxel. Since when do they fight like this?" "Since we stopped fighting like everyone else," Dra Kier responded over an open channel. "You're still trying to win the old way, through brute force and superior numbers. We've learned something different." The battle lasted 3 hours. When it ended, the mighty consortium fleet was in retreat, leaving behind dozens of disabled vessels and shattered pride. The Craxel had suffered losses too, but far fewer than anyone would have thought possible. But there was no time to celebrate. Even as the consortium fleet withdrew, new threats were emerging. The Shadowcrest cartel, watching from the sidelines, had drawn their own conclusions. If the Craxel couldn't be beaten through conventional warfare, they would try something more insidious. Within days, Craxel intelligence detected multiple Shadowcrest strike teams infiltrating their worlds. The cartel's assassins and saboteurs were legendary, capable of destabilizing entire governments through carefully targeted operations. What they weren't prepared for was how thoroughly the Craxel had transformed their society. Every colony, every outpost, had adapted the training they'd received from Earth. The Craxel's natural ability to sense vibrations through their scales had been refined into an early warning system. Their tendency to get into accidents had been turned into an advantage. They'd booby-trapped their own facilities in ways that only they could navigate safely. When Shadowcrest agents attempted to sabotage a major power facility on New Serpentis, they found themselves facing defenders who could move through maintenance shafts they considered too cramped for combat. Craxel security teams used their tails for extra mobility in tight spaces, turning the facility's infrastructure into a deadly maze. The cartel's assassination attempts failed spectacularly. Craxel leaders had abandoned traditional security measures in favor of protocols that played to their species' strengths. They kept moving, used decoys extensively, and relied on their natural capabilities rather than technology that could be compromised. But the greatest test came from an unexpected quarter. The hegemony of 7 stars, watching these events with growing concern, decided to take a more subtle approach. They initiated a diplomatic campaign, offering the Craxel protection in exchange for temporary occupation of their worlds. "It's a trap," General Steele warned during an encrypted communication with Drakir. "The hegemony's protection would turn your people into slaves in all but name." "We know," Drakir replied. "But refusing them outright would give them the excuse they need for military intervention. So we're trying something new, we're going to beat them at their own game." The Craxel's response to the hegemony's offer was masterful. They appeared to enter negotiations while simultaneously implementing what they called Protocol Hydra. Each time the hegemony's diplomats thought they were making progress, they discovered that the real authority had shifted to a different colony. Administrative centers were relocated overnight. Decision-makers seemed to multiply inexplicably. The hegemony's famed diplomatic corps found themselves tangled in a web of seemingly incompetent bureaucracy that was, in fact, a carefully choreographed dance. The Craxel had turned their reputation for confusion and failure into a diplomatic weapon. "I don't understand," one frustrated hegemony ambassador complained. "How can any species be this consistently inconsistent?" The truth was, the Craxel had learned to weaponize everyone's expectations of them. They acted confused when they were actually coordinating complex operations. They appeared to fumble negotiations while quietly strengthening their positions. Every perceived weakness was carefully calculated. Meanwhile, the second wave of human military advisors had arrived secretly on Craxel worlds, officially listed as cultural exchange specialists. They brought with them new training programs, advanced tactical doctrines, and most importantly, the benefit of humanity's experience in fighting against technologically superior opponents. "Your greatest advantage," Steele told a gathering of Craxel commanders, "is that everyone still thinks they know what you are. The galaxy's memories are long, they remember centuries of Craxel failure and assume that's all you'll ever be. Use that." The strategy proved devastatingly effective. When the Shadowcrest cartel launched a major offensive against 3 Craxel worlds simultaneously, they found their carefully planned operations falling apart against defenders who appeared to be acting randomly but were actually executing precisely coordinated counterattacks. The Dernick Consortium's second attempt to overwhelm the Craxel through superior firepower met an even more humiliating defeat. The Craxel fleet seemed to be everywhere and nowhere, using complex three-dimensional maneuvers that made traditional space combat doctrine obsolete. But it was the hegemony that faced the most frustrating challenge. Every attempt to exert diplomatic or economic pressure on the Craxel seemed to slide off them like water off their scales. Trade embargoes proved ineffective against a species that had spent generations learning to survive with nothing. Political isolation failed to impact a civilization that had never been truly integrated into galactic society. "They're not just fighting back," Lars observed during a secure briefing on Earth. "They're evolving faster than their enemies can adapt. Every time someone thinks they've figured out how to beat them, the Craxel change the rules of engagement." Steele nodded, studying reports from across Craxel space. "They've learned the most important lesson we could teach them: there's no single right way to fight. Every species, every civilization has its own strengths. The Craxel have stopped trying to copy others and started developing their own path." But even as the Craxel celebrated their successes, new storm clouds were gathering. The hegemony, frustrated by their inability to control the situation through conventional means, began assembling the largest military force seen in the sector in generations. The consortium and the cartel, swallowing their pride, were negotiating an alliance of convenience. The galaxy's powers had decided that the Craxel experiment in independence needed to end. They couldn't allow a species known for failure to suddenly start succeeding. It would destabilize the entire established order. As reports of the gathering fleets reached Craxel High Command, Drakir stood in the newly established Strategic Operations Center on Viridian Prime. The facility, built deep underground, represented everything the Craxel had become: efficient, unconventional, and far more dangerous than its unassuming exterior suggested. "They're coming for us," Syrah said quietly, her scales shifting through worried colors. "All of them. Together." Drakir's response was calm, his scales settling into the deep indigo of strategic thought. "Good," he said, activating a holographic display of Craxel space. "Because we're about to show them something they've never seen before, a Craxel victory that isn't a fluke." Around him, his officers straightened, their scales synchronizing in a display of unity that would have been impossible months ago. They had spent generations learning how to lose. Now they were about to show the galaxy what happened and the ultimate underdogs decided to win. The combined fleet of the Hegemony, Consortium, and Shadowcrest cartel emerged from hyperspace like an artificial constellation, over 1,000 ships strong, the largest military force assembled in the sector in living memory. Their target, the Craxel homeworld of Serpentis Prime. In the Strategic Operations Center, buried deep beneath the planet's surface, Drakir watched the enemy fleet's arrival with an expression that would have been unrecognizable to anyone who knew him 6 months ago. His scales held steady in a pattern of deep crimson and gold, colors of absolute focus and determination. "They're broadcasting their demands," Syrah reported, her tail coiled tightly around her command chair. "Complete surrender, immediate disarmament, and..." She paused, scales flickering with indignation, "mandatory rehabilitation of all Craxel who received human training." "How thoughtful of them," Drakir replied, his voice carrying an edge of humor that would have been impossible in his previous life. "They're offering to help us become failures again." He activated the command center's main communication array. "All units, commence Operation Phoenix." The plan they were about to execute was unlike anything attempted in the history of galactic warfare. It represented everything the Craxel had learned, not just from human training, but from generations of losing. The enemy fleet's first surprise came when their long-range scans showed Serpentis Prime completely undefended. No orbital platforms, no defense fleet, not even basic planetary shields. It looked, for all intents and purposes, like the Craxel had simply given up. "This has to be a trap," the Hegemony Admiral declared, studying his tactical displays with suspicion. "Of course it's a trap," the Consortium commander replied. "But what can they possibly do against our combined forces?" The Shadowcrest representative, a shadowy figure on their shared command channel, was less confident. "The Craxel aren't what they used to be. We should proceed with extreme caution." But the massive fleet pressed forward, their formation spreading out to establish orbital superiority around Serpentis Prime. That's when the first phase of Operation Phoenix revealed itself. The seemingly empty space around the planet erupted with quantum mines, millions of them, each barely larger than a human fist. The Craxel had spent months seeding them throughout their system, using their ship's superior maneuverability to place them in three-dimensional patterns that were now impossible to escape. But these weren't ordinary mines. As they detonated, instead of explosive force, they released clouds of specialized nanites, a technology the Craxel had developed by combining human insights with their own unique understanding of adaptation. "Our shields are failing," ships began reporting across the enemy fleet. The nanites weren't destroying their systems, they were modifying them, changing their operational parameters in unpredictable ways. That's when the second phase began. From hidden bases across the system, the entire Craxel fleet emerged, not in a defensive formation, but in small, highly mobile squadrons executing maneuvers that seemed to defy physics. Their ships, already known for unprecedented maneuverability, had been modified further. Each vessel now bristled with multiple control surfaces that only a species with prehensile tails could operate effectively. "This isn't a battle," General Steele observed from the secure command center on Earth, where he monitored the conflict. "This is a demonstration." The Craxel ship struck from impossible angles, their crews using their natural flexibility to endure maneuvers that would have killed most species. They didn't target their enemies' weapons or shields, instead, they focused on communication arrays, sensor systems, and command and control nodes. "They're not trying to destroy the fleet," Lars realized. "They're trying to blind it." In space, the battle descended into chaos. The enemy fleet, unable to coordinate effectively, began to fragment. Ships firing at suspected Craxel positions found themselves hitting their allies instead. The nanite clouds continued to spread, turning the battlefield into a technological fog of war. But the true masterstroke of Operation Phoenix was yet to come. As the enemy fleet struggled to regroup, they detected massive energy signatures emerging from Serpentis Prime's atmosphere. What they saw next would be recorded in military histories for centuries to come. The Craxel had transformed their entire homeworld into a weapon, but not in the way anyone expected. Massive gravitational pulse generators, hidden beneath the planet's surface, began firing in carefully calculated sequences. Each pulse was precisely calibrated to interact with the nanite clouds, creating gravitational eddies and vortices that no naval commander had ever encountered. "Impossible," the hegemony admiral breathed as he watched his mighty fleet being torn apart not by enemy fire, but by the very fabric of space itself being twisted into knots. The Craxel ships, their crews trained specifically for these conditions, danced through the chaos like water flowing through cracks. In the Strategic Operations Center, Drakir opened a channel to the enemy command ships. "You came here expecting to find the old Craxel, the species that always lost, that always surrendered. That species doesn't exist anymore. But we're willing to offer you a choice." He paused, allowing his scales to shift to a pattern that spoke of both strength and mercy. "You can retreat now, leaving behind your damaged ships for salvage, or you can continue this battle and discover just how much more we've learned about winning." The response came in stages. The Shadowcrest ships, their stealth systems rendered useless by the nanite clouds, were the first to withdraw. The consortium forces, their mighty capital ships now barely able to maintain stable orbits, followed soon after. The hegemony fleet held out the longest, their admiral refusing to accept defeat until 3 of his dreadnoughts collided with each other while trying to navigate the gravitational mayhem. Finally, facing the complete loss of his command, he too gave the order to retreat. As the enemy fleet limped away through hastily calculated hyperspace vectors, the Craxel celebration was unlike anything their species had ever known. They hadn't just won, they had fundamentally changed the galaxy's understanding of what was possible. In the aftermath, as damage reports were compiled and victory messages sent, Drakir received a private communication from General Steele. "Impressive," the general said, his holographic image smiling. "You've certainly come a long way from surrendering to maintenance drones." Drakir's scales rippled with pride and amusement. "We had good teachers. You showed us that the key to victory isn't just about learning to fight, it's about learning to fight as ourselves." "And what happens now?" Steele asked. "The galaxy won't forget this. You've proven yourselves too dangerous to ignore, too powerful to dismiss. Now," Drakir replied, "we do something even more surprising than winning. We're going to show them how to make peace with a species they can no longer underestimate." In the months that followed, the galaxy underwent a subtle but profound transformation. The Craxel, once dismissed as eternal losers, emerged as a unique power in their own right. Their victory hadn't just proven their military capabilities, it had demonstrated a new way of thinking about strength and adaptation. Trade delegations from across known space began arriving on Serpentis Prime, no longer seeking to exploit the Craxel, but to learn from them. Their unique approach to technology, their innovative tactical doctrines, and their ability to turn perceived weaknesses into advantages became subjects of study in military and civilian institutions alike. The hegemony, after much internal debate, formally recognized Craxel independence and offered a mutual defense pact, this time as equals rather than protectors. The consortium, impressed by Craxel ingenuity, sought technology-sharing agreements. Even the Shadowcrest cartel sent quiet overtures about potential collaboration. 1 year after the Battle of Serpentis Prime, Drakir stood before the newly established Galactic Cooperative Council. Gone was the nervous, apologetic figure in a pirate costume. In his place stood a leader who had helped transform not just his species, but the galaxy's understanding of potential itself. The Craxel story, he told the assembled representatives, is not just about learning to win. It's about learning that every species, every civilization, has its own path to excellence. We spent generations trying to be like everyone else, never realizing that our true strength lay in being uniquely ourselves. In the secure command center on Earth, General Steele watched the broadcast with satisfaction. You know, he told Lars, when they first came asking for help, I thought we were going to teach them how to fight. Lars nodded, understanding. Instead, we taught them something more important, how to believe in themselves. No, Steele corrected, they taught us something. They showed us that the greatest victories don't come from overwhelming force or superior technology. They come from having the courage to be different, the wisdom to learn from failure, and the vision to see strength in what others consider weakness. The Craxel would never again be known as the galaxy's perpetual losers. Instead, they became something far more interesting, living proof that in a universe of countless species and civilizations, true power comes not from copying others' strengths, but from transforming one's own unique qualities into advantages that no one else can match. And somewhere in the vast expanse of space, a maintenance drone floated past a Craxel patrol ship. The ship's crew, rather than surrendering, simply waved at it with their tails, a small gesture that symbolized how far they had come, and how much the galaxy had changed with them.